I get it. I know why you're here. It's like 10% me, 20% my projects, and 70% this bad boy. Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the Knitting Vicariously podcast. My name is Caroline. I am found more commonly across Instagram and Ravelry as Dunderknit. I am a knitter living in London, and if this is your first time watching the podcast, hello and welcome. I am still pretty new in this whole podcasting world here, and so if, like me, you are a little bit of a stickler for doing things in the correct order, you are entirely welcome, if not indeed gently encouraged, to perhaps go back and make a start on episodes 1 and 2. It just means that you're going to be able to get a little bit more of a kind of logical progression through some of the projects that I've been making, as well as perhaps a little bit more context on both me personally and the premise of the podcast. But if you're a giddy devil-may-care sort of rogue, or indeed if you've already watched those episodes and you're coming back to continue our conversation on a little further, then let me just remind you that this podcast is a swearing-friendly zone, and therefore if cursing is perhaps not your bag, if it's something that you're not comfortable with, or if you're watching this with children, this may well not be the podcast for you right now. I really appreciate you giving it a try, but yes, probably not going to be your bag. But otherwise, this is a podcast where we celebrate the creativity that we see all across this community, whether it be through makers, through designers, through publications, and as much as we would love to drop everything and start working on those projects, we are not always able to, and therefore we knit and enjoy them vicariously. To those of you who are returning viewers, thank you again so much for coming back. I don't want to keep doing this thing where I risk coming across as being self-indulgent and blowing smoke up all of our delicious arses, but again, I have been overwhelmed and just really grateful for the feedback you've given me over the last week or so. Every single message, comment, interaction I have received from you has made me smile, if not indeed like full-on snort laugh, which is a good look on me. And so I'm again just thank you so much for taking the time. To those of you in particular who mentioned that as soon as I referenced the fact that I was perhaps a little bit cursy, a little bit sweary, and instantly hit the subscribe button, I fucking love you. You are excellent individuals. Thank you so much for joining me. On the subject of truly excellent human beings, I do want to take a couple of minutes just to call out some really wonderful individuals who have not only taken the time to listen to me blathering on in the first instance, thank you all so much, but have also then taken time to go and to share this podcast with some of their own audiences or channels that they happen to be present on. And again, this is not intended to be an ego thing, far from it. It's an opportunity for me to say thank you to those individuals and show them how much I appreciate it, as well as hopefully, if for whatever reason you're unfamiliar with any of them yourselves, give me a chance to share some of the love back in their direction too. The first of these is a truly hilarious individual, and that is Louise of the KNITTINGVICARIOUSLY podcast. Hers is an audio podcast, and if you've been sitting there listening to me and thinking, well, she's fine, but I sort of want to listen to someone who is a lot funnier, a lot more Scottish, and has a specific segment that is more closely aligned to booze, Louise has got you covered. Louise and I met, I want to say about 4 years ago at a yarning event down in Brighton, but prior to that she's someone that I had been following on Instagram. I think it might even date back to the dark days of kind of like full on Twitter, but she is just the most wonderful and hilarious individual, and both in person and on her podcast. And I highly recommend you go and check her out, not least over on Instagram, because Elf on the Shelf is coming up and she always does a sterling job in that department, and also her posts that she has about her hopefully no longer quite so naughty puppy are just some of my absolute favourites on the internet. So yes, definitely please do check out Louise of the CAITHNESS Craft podcast. Next up is Tommy of Squirrel Pie Productions, and Tommy's is a podcast I've been watching for a while now. In addition to having just some of the most fantastic FOs and some really truly gorgeous yarns, so she is the dyer behind Moonstone Dye Works, I was delighted to see that Tommy is taking part in Vlogtober this year, which is a monthly vlogging challenge throughout the month of October where you post regular vlogs and updates, showcasing perhaps a little bit more insight around your days. And what I will say is Tommy's vlog is so serene and so calming, and that is no mean feat, particularly when you consider that she has a very, very young daughter who is just the most beautiful and curiously bright-eyed little girl that you will see. She is absolutely adorable. But I happened to be stopping in one day with Tommy's vlog. I was working from home one day and stopped in over lunchtime, was sitting quite happily at my desk with a bowl of soup, and literally stopped with the soup spoon halfway up to my mouth when I suddenly realised that my own face was staring back at me from the inside of Tommy's vlog. And it was like some really weird, trippy, soup-centred inception. And yeah, it was definitely a highlight, but I did have a moment where I thought I might be having some sort of trippy dream. But yeah, and then, you know, that gives you more of an insight into my working day than you probably needed to know. And you are welcome. And finally, we have Amy of the Happy Little Yarn podcast. Amy's was a new to me podcast, but I did see that she was doing the Vlogtober challenge, and so I was delighted to stop in with her and find out a little bit more about her days and what she's up to. I do know that Amy's based in Georgia, and that there was a curfew imposed last week around the time of the alerts for Hurricane Michael. So Amy, between you, yourself, and obviously anyone living in and around that area, I hope you, your friends, families, your homes are all safe and well, and my thoughts are very much with you. And if I've missed anyone, I really, really do apologise. If you have heard about this podcast through any other channels and feel compelled to leave a note or a comment below, I would really appreciate it. It means that I can go and thank those podcasters, either here or over on their pages separately, because I really do appreciate anyone who's taken the time not only to watch me and my giant face, but also to recommend it on their channels where appropriate. So thank you so much. One last thing before we get into the show proper. I might have mentioned over here on this podcast something about maybe going to this thing called Rhinebeck. Later on this week, I'm going to be heading over to the US on Wednesday and meeting up with some friends ahead of heading up to the New York Sheep and Wool Festival, aka Rhinebeck. And I feel like I've done a pretty good job of playing it pretty cool up until now. So, you know, I haven't come across as being like too giddy or excited or anything. So, you know, let's all hope that continues. Ish. But given the whole premise of this podcast is very much around enjoying things from a distance, perhaps things that we're not able to take the time or don't have the resources to be able to drop everything, go off and do, it only feels natural that we extend that to knitting festivals. And so there was a fantastic post that came up in the Ravelry group. It has unfortunately since been deleted, but I did still want to share it with you because it gave me an idea around creating a bit more of a sort of vicarious Rhinebeck feel to it. There was a poster called Fairy Cakes who has since disappeared, so I hope everything's okay, but they had posted a great piece about how they were looking to vicariously enjoy Rhinebeck by looking at the weather and perhaps wearing some mismatched hand knits over the course of that day, perhaps making some Rhinebeck themed food and enjoying some apple crisps and all those, and then maybe being able to shop from stash and having a bit of a cheeky cast on to enjoy over the course of the day. And I loved this post so much that it just made me think about, I would love to hear what you're intending to do to try and enjoy Rhinebeck vicariously. I appreciate there are probably people out there who are just sick to the back teeth of the mention of the thing. And look, as someone who has embraced and enjoyed the premise of Rhinebeck in previous years, where I have gone onto Ravelry and Instagram on the days themselves and posted slightly self-pitying pictures of me in my Rhinebeck sweater weather socks, wearing my Rhinebeck jumper that I knitted specially, and in one instance at least enjoying a donut and a very sizable glass of wine, even though I wasn't able to go in physical being. But as someone who's embraced the whole premise behind Rhinebeck in the past, look, I get it, I understand it, and it can be a little bit tiresome. And what I would say is I'm hoping to try and help with that a little bit. So what I would love is for those of you who aren't able to attend but still want to try and enjoy Rhinebeck vicariously, is to pop over to the Ravelry group, and that is the Knitting Vicariously podcast group over on Ravelry. You can find us by searching that in the groups tabs. And there is a specific thread which is a vicarious Rhinebecking thread. And in there, I would love it if you could just post a short post around what it is that you're intending to do to try and ensure that you're able to live vicariously across the Rhinebeck weekend itself. And what I will do for my part is, while I am at Rhinebeck next weekend, I'm going to do a little bit of digging. I'm going to try and put together a few special Rhinebeck items into a little giveaway, and then we'll use random number generator to select winner from that thread, and we will give those out accordingly. So hopefully that'll make your vicarious Rhinebecking that hopefully you should still be able to enjoy. I know some of my favourite cast-ons have been Rhinebeck related, and but hopefully it should bring at least one of you even more joy to that whole weekend. So yeah, fingers crossed. And to that point, just another quick reminder that show notes for this week's episode can be found both in the description box below as well as over on the Knitting Vicariously group in Ravelry. I do have specific episode threads for each individual episode. I have also been trialling a piece over on Instagram, where if you follow the Knitting Vicariously Instagram account, I will create one new post for each episode, and all of the makers and hashtags related to the makes from that week's episode will be published in that post as well. And that just means that if you do want to stalk updates or perhaps see a little bit more inspiration behind some of the projects that I've mentioned by using hashtags, you'll be able to find them reasonably simply over on Instagram. In terms of the format for this week's podcast, I do have some actual knitting to share. Some of the eagle-eyed amongst you may have spotted one of those items already, as well as some vicarious knits. And then I also mentioned that I was looking to answer some of your questions in this week's episode as well, which we'll come on to a little bit later. But first things first, actual knitting. Because without any further ado, ladies, gentlemen, and variations thereupon, I give you my stalactite sweater. I love it. I absolutely love it. This was the last of my Rhinebeck sweaters that I wanted to get knit, and it brings my grand total up to 4, which I'm very excited about. But this is the Stalactites pullover by Camille Rosset from Lane magazine issue 4, and I absolutely adore it. I mentioned last time I wasn't completely sure if I was going to go for the full turtleneck or instead just have a slightly shorter version. I did opt for the shorter version, and I'm pretty sure I made the right choice. My neck is a little bit on the princessy side, and while this wool has softened up beautifully with blocking and washing, I do still have a slight prickle just in and around the front of my neck here, and I do think if I'd gone too much further with the turtleneck that would have been probably a little bit more exacerbated. So as far as I'm concerned, this is pretty much spot on. But let me stand up and I will give you a little twirl. And here you have it. It's not quite as stag boobies as the stag boobies jumper, but it is at least stalactite boobies? I don't know if that's a thing. I don't know if that works. But essentially, boobs. Also sweater. And I love this. So as you will see, the patterning lines up beautifully. And it's not super boxy, but it's kind of boxy enough that it gives me just a really nice fit. The sleeves are pretty much spot on. It stops just on my sort of mid-hip length, and yeah, I really like it. Ta-da! I wasn't even in shot for that, sorry. But yes, I absolutely love this sweater. It is post-blocking, it has fluffed up and just bloomed ridiculously beautifully. If I hold this up here, hopefully you'll be able to see, and I also have the yarn itself here, you might be able to see the difference between the two. It's also got this lovely kind of fluffy halo to it, which I'm really enjoying. The yarn itself, as I've mentioned in previous weeks, is Wilderberry. It is their Merino, which is a woolen spun yarn. It is DK to light worsted weight. It's sourced and spun in Bavaria. It is a 2-ply, and you have roughly 220 meters, which is around about 240 yards to 100 gram skein. This is the medium grey colourway. I used their natural colourway for the stalactites. Each of the stalactite rows, I should mention, it only takes kind of 2 rows. It's only worked over 2 rows. So actually you're looking at the grand total of 16 rows on the body and then another sort of 32 across the arms, so it's very, very little of the contrast yarn that you're using at all. And even the main yarn, I think I used 5.5 skeins of this, which again, for a sweater with sort of high neck and reasonable length, it's not bad for me at all. But I know I really, really love this sweater. As I mentioned previously, I bought 1 skein of this yarn from Wild and Woolly in London, which is a fabulous yarn shop based over in, I don't think they're based in Stoke Newington, they're a little bit further over. Knit with Attitude is Stoke Newington, Wild and Woolly is a little bit further over to the east. But 1 skein was bought over there during a little impromptu yarn crawl with my friend Ellen, and the others were purchased from Isolde's website after I played around a little bit in my stash and realised that this would be the perfect yarn for this project, and I'm so glad that I did. But no, really, really enjoying this project. As I mentioned previously, I had some challenges with my gauge. So the gauge that I was getting, knitting this up on 4mm needles, which is the sort of gauge that I liked the best when I'd started knitting with it, I was getting, I think, round about 18 and a half stitches per 4 inches versus the recommended gauge of about 21, I believe. And so what I did was I ended up working out what it would take in terms of sizing for me to make up that difference. So if I were continuing to knit the size that I'd planned to, which was the size 48, the gauge that I was getting meant I would have ended up with a sweater that was significantly larger than that. So I looked at the total number of stitches that I was going to be having on the needles, that I was going to have on needles at the widest point around my bust, looked at that versus the gauge that was recommended versus the gauge that I was getting, and worked out what I actually needed to do was to cast on the size 40 to get roughly a size 48. And I think it's maybe a little bit on the snug side. It's probably closer to a 46 or a 47 inch, I think, once with blocking. But actually I'm still really, really pleased with how it's turned out and how the fit has been achieved, albeit through a little bit of trial and error in the first instance. So yeah, Rhinebeck sweater number 4, and Rhinebeck sweaters achieved, which, you know, with, I think I finished this on Friday morning, so with over a week to go, taking into account time zones, I'm pretty impressed with that. I expected that I was going to be knitting sleeves until like 2 AM the night before. I'm not really feel I can enjoy it quite so much if I haven't been stressing out at the very last minute, but you know, I'll take it where I can find it. And the good news is it looks as though it's going to be pretty chilly, certainly on the Saturday, and even more so now on the Sunday, although the weather forecast is still changing a little at the moment. So hopefully I will get the chance to enjoy this as well and not be baking alive in 24 degrees Celsius weather and whatever the counterpart is of that in Fahrenheit, 80-ish, I don't know, something. So yes, tremendously excited to have this off the needles and about my general person. I also have a couple of things that I have mentioned previously on the podcast, and in fact I'm sort of cheating because I have talked about them as being FOs previously, but now they are fully pommed and therefore pommed FOs. Oh, I love me a pom-pom. I'm a sucker for a pom-pom. But yes, these are my 2 Cardamom Coffee hats that I have shown in the last 2 episodes in the finished objects section, and both of them were previously pomless and now completely and utterly pommified. The designer of the Cardamom Coffee hat is Caitlin Hunter, who is known as Boyland Knitworks across the interwebs, and yes, I have talked about these in much more detail, including the yarns, in my previous episodes. Please do pop back and take a look if that is of interest. But in both instances, the pom-poms here are from COWLINGCOUNTRYCRAFTS, and they're faux fur pom-poms. This one has, in fact, a popper as well, which means it is interchangeable, removable, and all good things. So yeah, really very pleased about that. I will pop them on because, again, the good hair situation that we're enjoying today, it feels only right that we should disrupt that entirely. So yeah, let me just... Oh, I've got a pom. I love it. Oh, there's something about poms that just turns me into an absolute raving lunatic, but I get really excited. So yeah, that is my grey pom-pom and my Cardamom Coffee hat, which matches really quite nicely actually with the whole aesthetic. Good work. Oh, there we go. There's the crazy hair. This is the second Cardamom Coffee Hat that I finished up last week, and this has a beautiful cream pom-pom on there, and you will be able to see by looking at it that in some instances the tips, and I do mean just the tips, are beautifully sort of this dark brown, almost grey colour, and I really do enjoy those because there's nothing like a bit of gratuitous pom-pom tip fun. So yes, I didn't want to spend too much time on those. They are objects that I've finished in previous weeks and covered there, but I just wanted to showcase the poms because I've got poms. They're multiply. No, we're not going. No. Forget I said anything. In terms of works in progress for this week, I am continuing to work in the project that is still housed in my little grey girl bag with the pencil print that is my travel knitting, as I've mentioned in previous weeks. And in here I have, as well as yet another pom. Again, all about the tips. Beautiful, slightly dark grey, almost black tips. And in here we have my fledgling beeswax hat. The beeswax hat is a pattern by AMIE Mandala. I will put the finished object picture over here so you can see it. I think it's a hat that people are fairly familiar with by now, not least because I've been knitting it, but also because it's been doing the rounds for quite a while across Instagram and across Ravelry. It's a gloriously textured hat with a really fun cable pattern, and I'm really enjoying knitting it. So the yarn, as I've mentioned previously, is Hedgehog Fibres Merino DK in a colour that my phone cannot comprehend. Maybe if I hold it back here it's going to be closer, maybe ish, but this is the coral colourway, and it is the glorious mix of oranges, of peaches, of pinks, but generally all the neon all the time, and will go beautifully with its eventual pom-pom friend. I do also have the grey pom-pom as well, but this one is just in here for now, just to make sure that they are travelling buddies together. But yeah, really enjoying this knit. On here, my progress is being kept by this glorious little hand-beaded unicorn progress keeper that I love so much. It's so cute. And this is from Hannah, who is the Corner of Craft on both Instagram and YouTube as well. She has the Corner of Craft podcast, which is just such a delight, as well as these fantastic hand-beaded progress keepers and her yarn dyeing business, which is Chromatic Yarns. Hannah is going to be at the Nottingham Yarn Festival later on this year in November, so for those of you who are in the UK and planning to head along, I highly recommend you check out her progress keepers because they are some of my favourites and her designs just make me smile so much. But having this little guy complete with his shiny hooves and unicorn horn, was so cute though. It just makes me so happy. But yeah, I think between editing up the podcast, between the next couple of days, between as well some travel knitting and some travel time that I'm going to have, I'm not anticipating this is going to need blocking, and that will make it that much easier as well. But I reckon this is going to be finished in plenty of time ahead of the festival that I may or may not have mentioned later on this week. We should be fine. And so moving along into vicarious knitting, there is a project that I'm still planning to have on needles. It will be cast on almost straight after this podcast goes up, but for those of you who joined me back in episode 1 and remember this yarn, this is the Geronimo sock in Noir from the Hey Sister Yarn Co ladies, and it is a glorious tonal black sock yarn that is just stunningly pretty. And you will remember that I had plans for this sock yarn back in episode 1. I was looking to pair it with another yarn for a new no frill sweater and was looking to make that my Rhinebeck knitting for this year. And good news is the yarn has arrived. This just autumnal gothy awesomeness is the most stunning kid silk and mohair base, which is the Virgo base from a German hand dyeing company called Das Mondschaf, and this is their, it's 78% kid mohair, 72% kid mohair, 28% silk, and it is in the I Want to Believe colourway, and it is full of autumnal greens and golds and greenish mustards and purples and teals and blues and blacks, and I abso-fucking-lutely love this. The effect, I think you may recall that I mentioned I was going to go for, was this kind of like oil slick, luminescent, iridescent kind of effect, and I think these two are going to go together wonderfully. So I have 3 skeins of each, which is the amount that I used for my previous no frills sweater, which I knit out of Woolenvine yarns in her Volca and her Ghost Lace bases, both in Woolenvine number 9, held double. And it's just, the pattern itself, no frills, is by Petite Knit. It is a glorious, glorious, very simple raglan sweater, but it's the yarns that do all the talking, and I think with these two, it's going to be quite the conversation. So yeah, really, really looking forward to having this cast on and being able to show you how I got on with it. Elsewhere in Vicarious Knitting this week, I was quite literally stopped dead in my tracks when I was scrolling through Instagram earlier on in the week and I saw this post here by Thea Coleman. Thea Coleman is someone who designs the most incredible cabled sweaters of awesomeness, and this is the latest one that she's been teasing over on her Instagram feed. Now, this is, I believe, her Rhinebeck design for this year, and so I know almost nothing about this pattern. I don't know its name, I don't know what yarns it's knit in, or what weight it is. I'm making an educated guess that it looks a DK worsted, but other than that, I know nothing, except that I want it, and I want it on my needles really soon. Now, if you were someone who was heading over to a yarn festival later on this month, you would probably be thinking to yourself, do you know what? Given the whole premise of this festival is very much around yarn, I reckon there's probably going to be quite enough yarn there that I'll be able to find exactly what I'm looking for and more. Or you might think to yourself, yeah, there's going to be a lot of yarn there, absolutely. But what I think it's missing is more yarn. Those of you who've watched this for a few weeks now, I feel like you might know where I'm going with this. So one of the things I'm so looking forward to later this week, aside from the festival itself, is meeting up with friends who I've yet to actually properly meet in real life. And of those, one in particular is my hilarious, kind, generous, beautiful and super whip smart friend, Meredith. And in terms of enablers, I feel like I might have met my match, and that is impressive. We were having a chat about some of the vendors that are going to be at New York Sheep and Wool and things in particular we were looking out for. One of the things I had mentioned, and sort of frequent attendees of New York Sheep and Wool may be familiar with this, is some Cormo wool, particularly a sweater quantity of Cormo. Cormo is a breed of wool that is across, I believe, at least between Merino and Corriedale, and it is known for being incredibly soft. It tends to be a little bit more sort of close to farm breed rather than sort of being processed or going through kind of superwash processes. So it tends to be that little bit more rustic, but still being deliciously soft and squishy, and has just an amazing reputation for making really lovely sweaters and garments. And so I'd mentioned that that was definitely something I was going to be on the lookout for, to which of course Meredith said, well, there is one supplier who's not going to be at New York Sheep and Wool. Imagine my aghast expression when I find out that not everyone attends New York Sheep and Wool. And the vendor in particular that she mentioned and that she recommended and said I really couldn't pass up an opportunity to get some of her yarn was Elsa Wool. And so I looked at her site and did a little bit of gentle stalking, and so I really couldn't, between the range that she had and the reviews that it had on Ravelry, I really couldn't afford to pass this up, and I would be completely powerless to resist. And so I might already have done a little bit of pre-shopping to be waiting for me before I actually head over and attend the festival itself in person. Now, this is not going to be a review. I want to talk about it properly once I have the yarn in my grabby little hands. But in terms of the Vicarious knitting, in terms of its suitability in pairing it with a sweater pattern that frankly at the moment I know nothing about, I'm very excited. And so this is, ridiculous and potentially massively preemptive, right? But I'm quite excited. elsewhere in Vicarious Knitting, I have been delighted to see that so many of you are continuing to post both on Instagram with the Knitting Vicariously hashtag and over in the Ravelry group in our Show Us Your October Vicarious Knits. I've been able to catch sight of a few projects that you guys have planned, that you're thinking about and are very much top of mind, and want to take a minute or two just to share some of those that really did catch my eye. So first up, a massive thank you to the wonderful, brilliant designer that is Jen Emerson over on Instagram for bringing back to my attention the Northport hat by Amy Miller. This is a hat that appeared on, I think, Ravelry a few years ago now, but it is a glorious design. It was designed as part of a collection for Plucky Knitter, their all bundled up collection, and it is this gorgeous 4-ply hat with colourwork, which is definitely something that, as you can probably tell from the various Cardamom Coffee Hats that I've been knitting over the last few months, something that I'm really into at the moment. And it is just the most gorgeous design. It could be done with a multitude of different colours, with different combinations, and so this is definitely something that I want to be casting on later on this autumn. It is knit predominantly out of fingering weight yarns, I think all out of fingering weight yarns, and similar to the Cardamom Coffee Hat, the brim is knit on 2.75mm needles, which is a US 2, and the main body of the hat is knit on 3.25mm needles, which is a US size 3. So again, really similar sizing to the Cardamom Coffee Hat, and again a lovely colourwork pattern. So thank you, Jen, so much for bringing that to my attention. The colour choices that you posted over on Instagram are amazing, and I really look forward to seeing your finished hat. And then over in the Ravelry group, 2 users. So I believe it is Agapanthus66, Wendy, apologies if I have butchered that name massively, and Viking Purple Puss, who is Kay. They have both been chatting about the Ranunculus sweater by Midori Hirose, and I will put a picture up here for you to see it. It is a gorgeous light fingering or lace weight pullover, knit at quite a loose gauge. It is, in terms of yardage, so in terms of the gauge and the yardage that you're looking at, it could be a very, very quick knit. And for those of you who are in the southern hemisphere, who are heading into spring and who are sick to the back teeth of us with all our pumpkin spice lattes and our changing leaves, this could be a really nice knit for you, as well as just being a generally fantastic transitional seasonal sweater. I feel like I've seen a version of the sweater at events over here in the UK. I have a mental image of it in a very bright and vibrant red. I'm not sure if it is exactly this pattern or just something similar, but certainly every time I've seen it, it has stopped me dead in my tracks because it's such a lovely knit. In terms of weight and gauge, as I mentioned, it's light fingering, potentially even lace weight, and knit on a 6mm needle, which is a US size 8, so it would give a very, very loose and open fabric, but it's a really, really lovely effect. And yeah, definitely something that if you are looking for something that would be a great layering knit, or maybe just something to see you through the unseasonably warm continuing weather we have here in the UK, which it doesn't seem to have got the memo that it is now definitely autumn, this could be a really, really great project for you. So thank you both so much for bringing this to my attention. And so, in a slight departure from previous week's podcasts, I'm now going to move along to the question and answer section, because many of you were very, very kind and delightfully gently inquiring, as well as, you know, just downright nosy, enough to send over a few questions both on Instagram, on YouTube, on Ravelry, and I'm going to do my best to answer some of them here. Now, I will say there were a lot of questions, and some of them were duplicates, and so some of them I can kind of group up and answer together. Some of them were just delightfully random, and I definitely don't want to miss answering those. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to try and split them into 2 groups. I will answer some today on this week's podcast, and those will be the ones where I receive kind of multiple different people asking similar questions. But I will also try, and I emphasise on try, to handle the second group of questions as part of a separate podcast that I will look to post while I'm away. So to be clear, it will be a very light episode. I'm not going to have any extra knitting to show because it's basically now, but in a bit. But I will at least have some time to answer a few more of your questions and hopefully just give you a little bit more entertaining content before I get back. And, you know, film a podcast that basically involves me just lying on the floor and writhing around in a bunch of yarn. That wasn't meant to sound quite as dodgy as it did. I mean, it might be, but I feel like YouTube would probably get upset by that. I feel like a lot of people would be upset by that. Let's forget I said it. Thank you all so much to those of you who did send over questions. I really enjoyed going through them and finding out a little bit more about what you would like to know. As I mentioned, I'm going to try and split them into two. So the ones that I address today are going to be questions I received from a few different people, and just try and make sure that I'm covering all the bases in that respect. So yeah, let's move on to the questions. So after my impromptu outbursts on last week's episode, where I proved emphatically that yarn is in fact the universal language of knitting friendship, a couple of people, including I think it's Corinne, or it might be Karen, over on YouTube, apologies if I've mispronounced your name, she asked about my German and how it was that I was able to speak German, limited though it may be. So I studied a little bit of German at school. I think I had about 3 or 4 years of German when I was at school, but it wasn't really until I moved to London to go to university that I started to study it properly. Properly is maybe a stretch. More, shall we say, because I didn't specifically study German at university. What I studied at university was European politics. And I say that with a smile because I'm very conscious that European politics is something that is at the forefront of an awful lot of people's minds at the moment, and perhaps not for the most positive or enthralling of reasons. Now, I am conscious that people sometimes get very upset when politics features in podcasts like knitting podcasts that are designed to be a little bit more kind of light touch and perhaps an opportunity to provide a little escapism. But what I will say is I mentioned right up front in episode 1 that my intention is to be authentic and transparent and open with this podcast. And while I do not intend by any stretch to make this into a political podcast at all, because if nothing else, knitting vicariously is one thing, voting vicariously, that is a very bad idea. But I do just want to make it clear that I'm not going to ever shy away from talking about politics as and where it is relevant. It is something that is very much a feature of me, given it is something that I studied, and therefore it's not something I'm going to avoid. At the same time, I'm not going to turn this into a political podcast. Far from it. But just a word of warning for those of you for whom, you know, that is something that you desperately want to avoid. Personally, in my opinion, I am not sure that in the current political climate any of us can afford to avoid this, but at the same time I appreciate it's not something that you necessarily want to have rammed down your throat, and that is absolutely not what I'm going to be doing. So just to alleviate your concerns on that front. But yes, as part of studying European politics at university, I did have the opportunity to take my 3rd year and to study abroad. And as part of that, I was able to spend a year living and studying in Berlin, in Germany, which is just the most fascinating, incredible city. Obviously, its history is incredibly fascinating. The challenges that its population have had to endure, to put up with, to overcome, have just been incredibly imprinted on a city and its culture, its heritage and its people. But it's also just the most amazing place of a kind of cultural melting pot and opportunity to really kind of see and get to know people from across the whole of the country and not just from Germany itself. I arrived there on the eve of my 20th birthday, and what I will say is there is nothing quite so humbling as to wake up on the first day out of your teenage years, turning 20, in a country where nobody gives a shit. And don't get me wrong, that's not self-pitying. I was very lucky. I was able to make friends. I ended up spending an awful lot of time working with and having a lot of fun with an English-speaking theatre group, predominantly Germans, but all English speakers who had just the most incredible English. They were so kind as to let me practice my German as well, I should add. But it was funny because when I was in the UK, I'd spent a lot of time in sort of taking part in supporting German productions. So it was nice to see it flipped on the other side. But just a fantastic group of people and an awful lot of fun and just a properly incredible year. But yes, it does mean that I still remember a fair bit of my German, certainly not as much as I used to be able to. But there is something about beer that tends to make me improve dramatically. I don't know if it's some sort of, almost like muscle memory, or if it's just a confidence thing. But what I will say is after a beer or two, my German is far more flüssig. So over on Ravelry, both Fibre Nymph and Rupert's Land asked this question, as well as Sewing in Hens, Kelmscott Designs and Falula over on Instagram, all of whom were incredibly interested to know, what is my day job? I mentioned right up front that it is not knitting related, much as my stash wall might lead you to think otherwise. And obviously I've touched on the fact that my background is in European politics, so you might think, hey, perhaps it's something in that sort of general region. No, really no. So after spending 4 years studying European politics and German, I had contemplated going into the European Civil Service, and I think in hindsight, let's all be very delighted that that's not a path I chose to go down, because if I'm a little bit frustrated now, imagine how much worse that could have been. But I'm not going to go into all the detail, partly because I want to keep it slightly separate from this podcast, but also because it's a very long story. But I took a sort of long, quite circuitous route to where I am now, and I've been working in this industry for the last, I think, 8 to 10 years. I work in the consumer technology industry, looking at things like app development, like mobile phones, like wearables and smart home technology, with a particular focus on developing new products and product marketing. And those things are essentially a sort of slightly corporate and wordy way of saying I really like trying to understand what people want or need that technology can perhaps help with or facilitate, trying to develop products that build on that, so that help to answer those needs, and then try to talk to people about those products and see if they fulfill them. And if not, then we kind of redevelop and redesign and change those and optimize them, and basically get to a point where we are developing products that hopefully make a difference to people's lives. And it's something I'm really, really passionate about. It's something I really enjoy. As I mentioned, I've worked in a few different areas and industries, whether it is wearable technology, whether it's smart home. And I really, really enjoy developing and creating new things in that space, using technology to make things better. I don't get to speak German quite as much as I did when I was at university, although in previous years I did have a role that involved looking after the German territory, and so I did get to speak a little bit of German there. It was a little bit more corporate and a little bit less colloquial than the German I'd learned up until that point, and certainly there was very little knitting related German involved in it, but it was a chance to brush up a little bit. But for the most part, no, I don't get to speak it in my day job, unfortunately. I also don't get to knit during my day job at all. I know I referenced in episode 1 an interaction that I had with a former colleague of mine called Kevin, and that was true. So that was a reasonably quiet day, and also during our lunch breaks, and I had just stumbled across something on Instagram that I had to cast on for there and then, and luckily Kevin, with his knees, was very amenable. So I'm very grateful to him for that still to this day. The only real exception is on days when I'm able to work from home. I have been known on a couple of occasions on a very long and arduous conference call to get out a sock and maybe just add a couple of rounds to it. But for the most part, unfortunately, knitting at work is not something I get to spend a huge amount of time doing. Instead, for me, it tends to be either on the commute to and from work or in the evenings that I'm able to enjoy it. But yeah, it's not too much of a loss. I think I really enjoy what I do during the daytime. It's something that I'm incredibly passionate about, and so outside of work, it's nice to have something else to focus on for a change. So yeah, that's me. So the penultimate question for this week's episode comes from my lovely friend Stacey Elston, as well as DB Shafino, hopefully I pronounced that correctly, both over on Instagram, who asked, yeah, I'll be honest, I'm not very good at planning projects ahead of time. It's such a good question, but what I tend to find is that if I go to yarn festivals with projects in mind, it's quite difficult for me sometimes to discern between different options. So if I go and I say, right, I want to buy yarn for this sweater, and I see yarn that works for that sweater that I quite like, I will buy it. And then the problem is later on, I see 3 other things that would also work, and I can't quite work out if it's buyer's remorse or if I just get very conflicted. I just struggle with it a little bit. So I tend to look at things from the other way round, which is if I see yarn that I like, I will find a project that works with it. And so yeah, I do tend to put the yarn first a little bit in that regard. And that does mean that sometimes I end up with yarn that perhaps I haven't got the right yardage for a project as and when it arises, or it's yarn that isn't perhaps going to be used straight away, which, but it's just my preferred way of doing things. Otherwise, I just struggle trying to think of it that way around. But I think my perspective can be summed up almost entirely perfectly by another great friend of mine who is Julie Tillyflop over on Instagram, who has Tillyflop Designs based in the UK, which is just the most gorgeous set of incredibly funny knitting and crochet related, I should say, cards and accessories, and she sums it up best when she says, do you impulse buy yarn or do you always have a plan? And what on earth is a plan anyway? Exactly. Nailed it, Julie. Nailed it. And Julie has seen me at enough festivals to know that I have zero concept of planning ahead of this time, so I like to think she already knew what the answer was going to be to that question. And last but not least, from Knit Happens X on Instagram, suitcase, singular. That's it for this week. I so appreciate you joining. As I mentioned, more of your questions and hopefully my answers will be showcased in a separate episode that I will look to upload next week while I'm away. But thank you again so much for sending those over. I really appreciate it. They did give me an awful laugh as well. I really enjoyed it. I would love you to continue to post over in the Ravelry group with your Vicarious knits, as well as posting your answers for our Vicarious Rhinebeck giveaway over in that thread too. Similarly, if you are on over on Instagram, I would love you to keep using the Knitting Vicariously hashtag, where you have projects or stash or patterns that you've been inspired by, that you desperately want to work on but haven't quite had the time to do so. And yeah, other than that, again, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a wonderful rest of day, rest of week. I hope your knitting is keeping you happy and fulfilled, and if it isn't, I hope you have an opportunity to knit vicariously. Keep on keeping on, and I will see you again next time. Bye. Again, I have been overwhelmed and I am very grateful, and now I'm talking rubbish, and this is going really well so far today. I think we're all winning. That's what I'd say. I am incredibly lucky that I am heading out to the US to meet up with some friends, many of whom I have never met in person, and have an opportunity to say hi and to do some real damage. But on the yarn sense, not to them. I'm not going to hurt them. I'm really not that sort of person. I feel like that came out wrong with it. Let me stand up and I'll give you a little tour. Tour? Twirl. Tour. That sounds invasive. Let's not do that. No, thank you, please. Oh, this is a gloriously volume static situation that we've got going on here. Yep. Good. Good. Uh-oh. We all still here? We all okay? You alright? Good. Whew. Blah blah blah. I have a new sippy cup this week. It is most excellent. It allows for all of the adult beverages whilst also being very dainty.